You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
K-pop Demon Hunters Haja Boy's breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
Right now at the Home Depot, shop Spring Black Friday savings and get up to 40% off, plus up to $500 off select appliances from top brands like Samsung. Get a fridge with zero clearance hinges, so the doors open fully even in tighter spaces in your kitchen. And laundry that saves you time, like an all-in-one washer-dryer that can run a full load in just 68 minutes. Shop Spring Black Friday savings, plus get free delivery on appliance purchases of $998 or more at the Home Depot. Offer valid April 9th through April 29th. U.S. only. See store online for details.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 253, Greece, part 6, The Invasion Begins. This week, a big thank you goes out to an anonymous supporter on Ko-Fi and to Martin, MD, and ODB for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. On April 6, 1941, the Germans would launch their long-planned invasion of Greece, with the codename Operation Marita. None of the participating armies were surprised that the Germans were launching an attack. Obviously, their Italian allies knew what was going to happen, but even their enemies, the British and the Greeks, had more than enough information gathered by Allied intelligence to prevent it from being a real surprise. The goal for the Germans was to deal with the Greek problem as quickly as possible, but they had bigger plans for later in 1941. For the Greek and British forces, the goal was delay. There was little hope of throwing back the Germans completely, but there was the hope that they could have some kind of holding action mounted along a series of defensive lines that were being built across Greece. The Allies would fight hard in some instances. There would be some early successes, but in the long run, the numbers, equipment, and planning were against them, and very quickly areas of Greece began to fall to the German advance. Salonika would fall in a few days. The Allies would be thrown out of their unfinished defenses, first at the Metaxas Line, and then at the Aliakmon Line, and they would be forced further south. The Luftwaffe would launch seemingly endless air raids, both against the retreating forces and against Greek cities. The defense of Greece turned into another, in a long string of Allied disasters. In some ways, it was different. In some ways, it was exactly the same. And for the third time in just 12 months, the British Army found itself frantically moving to the coast, hoping for evacuation. The Royal Navy would once again be able to rise to the occasion, and not for the last time. But that is the end of the story, and it is the policy of this podcast to start at the beginning. So let's start by looking at the German plans for their invasion. The invasion of Greece would be executed by the German 12th Army, under the command of General List. The goal was a quick movement into Greece, but importantly, the primary thrust would be launched from the newly captured territory of Yugoslavia. This would prove to be a way around the Greek defenses known as the Metaxas Line, and it would take full advantage of the fact that the Greeks had not prepared the same level of fortifications for an invasion out of Yugoslavia. At the same time as the main thrust, led by the 2nd Panzer Division, attacked through Yugoslavia and then into Greece, mountain troops would put pressure on the Metaxas Line with the goal of capturing the important Rupel Gorge, which would restrict Greek movement. Then all the forces would push for Salonika as the first main objective of the attack, seizing the important port before then moving on to Athens. Salonika was actually less important to the British and Greeks than it had been during the First World War, with the vulnerability of the port being known to the defenders, and therefore as much shipping as possible was actually routed through ports further south. But of course, losing territory was never great, and the Allies losing the important port of Salonika would not be a good way to start their defense. If everything went according to plan, the German attack would be over in a matter of a few weeks, and the most important troops, those that had a role to play in Operation Barbarossa, would be pulled out of Greece and moved north. Speaking of Operation Barbarossa, obviously the podcast is not there yet, although we should start on those episodes late this year. We do have to talk about it, because of the looming operation casts a heavy shadow back on the German operations in Greece. Marita and the invasion of Yugoslavia before it did impact the scheduling for Barbarossa, but the full scope of the impact is hard to determine. What we do know is that the troops that were involved in the campaigns in the Balkans were needed for Operation Barbarossa, which would involve a huge percentage of the total strength of the Wehrmacht and almost every single armor and motorized unit. This meant that especially for those armored and motorized units, any that were used in Yugoslavia and Greece would have to have a period of refit and resupply before they could play their role in the attack on the Soviet Union. This makes the spring of 1941 a very busy time for the Germans, and in fact, as the plans for the Balkans came into clarity and then were executed, a delay in Barbarossa was made official, moving it 4 to 6 weeks into the future. This put the new date on June 22nd, the date that it would actually happen. However, there were many other factors that contributed to this delay. It wasn't just because the Germans had added these Balkan operations. In any case, the invasion could not happen before roughly the middle of May due to weather and the spring rains, and this would become apparent to the Germans as they developed their plans. This was especially true in 1941 because it would be quite a late spring in the Western Soviet Union, and there were still a lot of issues with mud and water that would be encountered into June. This meant that in actuality, if the Balkan adventure had any impact at all, it was at most a few weeks. And when looking at the course of events during Operation Barbarossa, it is the official opinion of this podcast that such a delay had very little to do with the outcome of the operation. Don't worry, I'll justify that view in the future. The more important impact may have been on the wear and tear on the units involved, and they would generally require some rest, recuperation, and refitting after their travels, particularly on vehicles that had very clear usage limits on their parts that they had expended some of in Greece and the Balkans. But this impact was quite small, I think, and again, did not greatly influence the opening days and weeks of Barbarossa. I think the idea that the German adventure in the Balkans greatly impacted Barbarossa and maybe even caused it to fail is probably a post-war sort of device or rationalization for the British involvement in Greece, or at least that probably played a part in why this idea that Greece was so important to Barbarossa sort of happened in the years after the war. But I'm not sure the idea that Greece was so impactful holds up to what we now know about the operations, both in Greece and what would happen in the Soviet Union in the last half of 1941. But let's move back to Greece and out of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will have plenty of time on the podcast later. Before the invasion would begin, a decision would be made by General Wavell, the commander of British forces in the Mediterranean. The plan had been to start moving the 7th Australian Division to Greece to join the Australian and New Zealand troops that were already moving into Greece and taking up their defensive positions. However, on April 5th, the decision was made not to send the 7th Division because of action that was occurring in Libya. The German Afrika Korps had attacked a few days earlier and seemed to be on the move towards Tobruk, and so parts of the 7th Australian would be rerouted to Tobruk instead of on the way to Greece, and in Tobruk they would have a very busy time over the following few months. In retrospect, this decision was a good one because it prevented any possibility of the 7th Australian being on its way to Greece when the attack began, because it would not take very long before all possible shipping was required for the evacuation. At 5:30 a.m. on April 6th, the Greek government would be officially informed by the German ambassador that the Germans were going to invade Greece. The official reason that was provided at the time was that the British forces were based in Greece, and that forced the Germans into Greece to deal with them. Britain and Germany were, after all, at war. Now, of all the justifications Germany gave for invasions during this period of the war, honestly, I probably find this one the most legitimate. The British were in Greece, and that did pose a threat to German interests, and Britain and Greece were at war. So, not that it actually mattered too much, I just find it interesting to note that this was somewhat legitimate. Greece was no longer a neutral power in the war with Germany once British forces were involved. The first 2 days of the attack were actually quite a bit less successful than the Germans had hoped. There were many challenges due to the terrain and the Greek defenses, but the Germans had planned to push through them quite quickly, particularly in the areas of the Metaxas Line. The Greek defenses in the line were not a joke, and in some areas they would stop the German attack on the first day, particularly in the crucial Rupel Pass area that the Germans needed to capture. In this area, the German material and experience advantage was counteracted by the work put into the defenses before the German attack. The Greeks had taken care to camouflage their defensive positions against air attack, which largely negated the advantages the Germans enjoyed in the air and made Stuka attacks hard to execute. They had also taken care to clear fields of fire and to position enough firepower in the defenses to throw significant amounts of fire at the German advance. Unfortunately for the Greek forces, the Germans were determined, and in some areas the Greek defenses would hold out until the Germans were able to close with them and destroy them at point-blank range with demolition charges and flamethrowers. But the Greek defense was not prepared in other areas, and in several areas the German forces were able to easily move through the Greek defenses, pushing all Greek forces west and south. This meant, as had so often happened during the first 2 years of the war, even the defenders that held the line were forced to begin giving up their defensive positions due to flanking threats where other defenses had failed. This threat became acute after the Germans were able to advance in the area around Lake Doiron, about 50 kilometers north of Salonika. The German presence in that area meant that most of the Metaxas Line had to be evacuated, and Greek forces began to pull back to the coast for possible evacuation. The 2nd Panzer Division would arrive at Salonika late on April 8th, after having pushed through the Greek forces south of Lake Doiron. The Greek commander in the area would immediately enter into discussions with the Germans for the surrender of the port, and even though the Germans demanded unconditional surrender, this would be agreed to early on the 9th. With the surrender of Salonika, the first major German objective had been achieved after just 3 days of fighting. During those 3 days, around 1,000 Greeks were killed and 1,200 were wounded, while the Germans lost about 550 men with 2,000 wounded. The Greek forces had in many instances fought well, but the plan to hold the Metaxas Line as long as possible had resulted in 4 of the 6 Greek divisions involved either being captured or disorganized to the point where they would not be effective forces in the days and weeks that followed. It was the price that was paid due to the Greek insistence that the Metaxas Line be held, even though the British refused to move their forces into the line to assist. While some criticism can be leveled against the Greek decision to man the Metaxas Line, the instances where the Greeks had defended well in those very good defenses would see some of the most punishing fighting for the Germans of the entire invasion, so the plan to use the defenses of the Metaxas Line was not completely without merit. The Greeks just didn't have the manpower to make it actually work.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You know those friends who support your preference for podcasts over music on road trips? That's the energy State Farm brings to insurance. With over 19,000 local agents, they help you find the coverage that fits your needs, so you can spend less time worrying about insurance and more time enjoying the ride. Download the State Farm app or go online at statefarm.com. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
One of the more important areas of Greece for the British forces was the port of Piraeus. Piraeus is a port in southern Greece outside of Athens and was a critical port for British forces, as it was a place where men and supplies were offloaded after their trips from Egypt. It would be attacked by Luftwaffe bombers in the early morning hours of April 7th, and it would catch the British defenses by surprise, even though the raid had previously been discovered through the decryption of Luftwaffe Enigma messages. Well, one of the ships that was hit was the SS Clan Fraser, which was carrying a load of ammunition, which of course explodes under the right circumstances. Well, the ship would catch fire, and even though some of the ammunition would be offloaded as quickly as possible, the ship would eventually explode, in apparently spectacular fashion. 7 other merchant ships were destroyed or heavily damaged in the explosion and the resulting fire. The loss of those merchant ships was bad enough, but the damage caused would close down the port for 2 days, 2 crucial days of fighting during the invasion. While the Greeks were falling back from their Metaxas Line positions, the situation for the British troops along the Aliakmon Line was deteriorating even before the Germans arrived. On April 8th, British intelligence had intercepted and decrypted messages from the Germans that pointed towards a German attack through the Monastir Gap. The route of advance would be used by the German troops of the 40th Panzer Corps and would allow them to advance out of Yugoslavia and get behind the British troops in their Aliakmon positions. Receiving this information was good for the British because it allowed them to prepare. However, due to the lack of forces available, it was not a question of bringing in more units to defend against the German attacks, but instead moving troops out of their defenses on the Aliakmon Line so that they would not be outflanked. This meant that the 4th and 6th New Zealand Brigades were ordered out of their defenses that they had spent the last month preparing. It was a bad way to start the defense, and it would not get much better afterwards. As soon as the German forces began to arrive against the British and Greek positions, the Allied forces began a fighting retreat to the south. Throughout the period of April 11th through the 17th, the Germans would continue their advance, although slowed by successive rearguard operations. The Allied forces were only really saved by the weather, some German logistical issues that slowed their advance, and a few well-sighted and defended delaying positions along the route. The fighting that would happen was tough, and the Allied forces did not just give up without a fight, and often put up strong resistance for at least some period of time. Lieutenant Crystal would be involved with the fighting on April 11th and would say, quote, "We did a fair bit of scrapping all morning, and about 11 a.m. it began to snow and continued on and off all that day and night. The snow was so thick that it was just like a smoke screen, and it allowed Jerry to come practically onto us." End quote. Some of this fighting was quite costly on both sides. For example, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment would lose about 2/3 of its tanks during the early stages of the retreat. Although it should be said that, of course, some portion of those losses were due to mechanical breakdowns, which had to be left behind, the classic problem of armored units in retreat during the war. Even if there were some small victories and some really good delaying actions that were being fought along the way, the question that started to be very important was if the Allied forces would be able to make a stand somewhere in Greece before they ran out of territory and evacuation operations would have to begin. General Wilson, the British commander, had already been making some plans as soon as it became clear that the Aliakmon Line would have to be abandoned, and the new line of defenses would be placed to the south, with two of the most important areas being Servia Pass and the passes around Mount Olympus. Here, the British forces would again attempt to blunt the German attack. One of the primary challenges during this time was coordination with the Greek forces that were working with the British forces. This caused issues as new lines of defense were drawn and there were attempts to man them with mixed forces. Wilson himself would later write in his report about the campaign that, quote, "From the outset, in spite of every possible effort being made to avoid misunderstanding, the Greek Central Macedonian army failed in every way to carry out its role in the withdrawal." End quote. Now, I highly doubt that it was entirely the fault of the Greek leaders in this case, and I'm sure there were communication and coordination breakdowns on both sides of the discussions. I find it hard to believe that Wilson wouldn't shift at least a little bit of the blame to the Greeks, too much of the blame to the Greeks. There were certainly issues on both sides. Now, these communication issues would manifest in a failure of the Greek forces on the British left to retreat fast enough. These were the forces that spanned the gap between the British forces and the Greek forces in Albania. This left the Greek forces in a salient that became more and more vulnerable with every British movement southward. This fact, along with others, led to a lack of confidence in the line of defenses, and therefore even as early as April 12th, less than a week after the start of the offensive, and before the Germans had really tried to attack the new line of British defenses, plans were already being made for further British retreats southwards. Such a move was almost certain to break the connection between the Greek forces on the British left, who would not be able to retreat further south without quick and decisive movement of Greek forces in Albania, which was unlikely to happen. Even with these issues and possible future plans, New Zealand troops were moved into the Servia Pass positions to block any German advance through the area. Like many mountain passes, Servia started out relatively wide, but narrowed to a point just 60 yards or 55 meters at its narrowest. This was good defensive terrain, and in fact, one side of the pass was not even suitable for the New Zealanders to take up defensive positions on, and certainly was not capable of allowing for German advances. The good news is that the New Zealander troops would have at least some time to get into defenses as well, due to some help from the weather. The Luftwaffe was always a problem as the British were retreating, just as they had been for armies since the start of the war, with a combination of Bf-109s and Stukas harassing any forces found in the open. However, there would be some cloudy weather and rain that would shield the Servia Pass positions from the worst of the German air attack efforts, although it would begin to clear on the afternoon of April 13th. The German advance on the ground was slowed by the fact that the British had also been able to destroy many of the bridges that were required to cross the Aliakmon River, which they had retreated behind. When the German forces tried to then cross the river on pontoon bridges or makeshift crossings, they were often hit by British artillery fire, although there were never enough guns to fully prevent the German crossings. But when the German panzer troops got across the river, they then found their way through Servia to be blocked by the New Zealanders. The defenders at Servia were also joined by defenders on the Olympus passes or Mount Olympus passes, and they would continue to hold against the German attacks throughout the first day of the German efforts once they crossed the river. In both cases, the strong British defense was a major change for the German troops, which had been advancing without any real resistance against them for several days. The ANZAC troops were also able to knock out many German tanks during this period of defense, because they greatly benefited from the terrain that they were defending. The German forces began to try and find ways to outflank them, and they would eventually be successful, although the orders to retreat from the passes would arrive before any forces were trapped by this German flanking movement. While the fighting was still occurring in the Servia and Olympus passes, Wilson would receive additional intelligence about the future course of German operations, including their attacks around the passes that were trying to get behind his forces. This added some immediate urgency to the British retreat to a new line further to the south, this time centered on the pass at Thermopylae. However, the forces at the various important points along the line had to hold off the German advance while the retreat continued. This was because if the Germans broke through any of the more important areas too quickly, they would be able to cut off other groups of forces that were moving south. One of these really important areas was the Vale of Tempe, where there were miles and miles of troops, supplies, and equipment that were being frantically moved to the south to get away from the German advance. All of this movement was happening because by early on April 19th, the retreat to the Thermopylae line was in full effect for the ANZAC forces, and if they wanted to be successful at establishing this new defensive position, they had to get all of their stuff, all of their supplies further south, and then very, very quickly evacuate all of the frontline troops down to the south as quickly as possible, because they had to beat all of the German forces, all the various groups of German forces to the new line. Otherwise, they risked the entire defensive line being compromised by another flank attack. As units got into place on this new Thermopylae line, it was clear that they were not just protecting the British forces from further retreats, but they were also there to provide a shield for the coming evacuation of all British forces from Greece. Because by April 19th, Wilson had already made the decision to evacuate Greece, and he had already informed Greek leaders, who were actually more supportive than you might imagine. A situation that we will discuss in more detail next episode.